nation fails and Constitution sails. I am, as always, your host, Christopher Paul Lovedale, MEDMA. We are Duncanville High School in these United States, and today is October 12th, 2020. And on this date in history, 528 years ago today, Christopher Columbus accidentally landed in the New World, discovering a land where 50 to 74 million people lived. And also on this date in history, yesterday on the 11th, it was the 12th anniversary of my sister's wedding to my former student, Chad. So they're happily married, they have 2 kids. They live in Omaha.
Did I just say birthday? It was their wedding anniversary. So if I said birthday, that really doesn't make any sense. My sister was married to my former student, Chad, uh, on this date in history yesterday. That was back in 2008. So sorry if I got confusing there. Puppy dog haircuts. Okay. So we need to start moving towards the end of the revolution, and that's where we are right now. Alexander Hamilton leads a key attack on British defenses in the Battle of Yorktown. This is one of the things that gets him a little bit more attention from George Washington, and ultimately will help earn him a position within his cabinet. Also, if you've ever seen the musical Hamilton, this is in no way kind of sometimes. Actually, the Hamilton's based on Hamilton. Okay. By the way, I'm a big fan of Hamilton and the economic impact that he had on the creation of the United States. So, if you're not, I don't care. I will fight you. It'll be bad. No one will ever survive, including us. Okay, so anyway, so Yorktown in itself, this is where everything falls apart for the British. Washington is there. Uh, the Marquis de Lafayette is there. Rochambeau is there. Basically, all the American forces converge around General Cornwallis, causing him to surrender, and Parliament agrees with the end of the American Revolution. You can see in the picture on the left there is Washington on his horse, and he is famously getting the sword to signify the surrender of the British Army. So, what do I want to say? I think that's it. So I'm going to go ahead and keep moving here, okay? Because a lot of things are going to be happening. But this does end the war. So the Treaty of Paris is oh crap, one thing. I'm going back. October the 19th, 1781. So this is basically a week from today. This is when we should be celebrating the American Revolution, okay? The victory of the American Revolution, where we won our actual independence, okay? We should have off school next week on Monday because that's the day that we actually won the revolution. But instead, what are we doing? We are coming to school like normal because we're celebrating instead the day we decided to get our revolution and not the day that we actually won it. So, congratulations for nothing. So, this leads us to the Treaty of Paris of 1783. It took 2 years for them to hammer out the details to create a lasting peace between the British and the Americans and the French, and yeah, well, basically the three countries. So, the goal was, or the Treaty of Alliance, if you remember, when we signed that with France, it said that we would not negotiate without them. Okay, so we would only negotiate with France, but then we found out that if we negotiated without France, we'd get better terms. So we blew off the very first treaty that we signed. So as a result, Britain will recognize the United States. Okay, a key point in the development of any country is being recognized. Two, they keep Canada. And three, they give Florida to Spain. Uh, by the way, Spain still has what was formerly the Louisiana Territory, and they basically have everything west of the Mississippi and everything south of Georgia. Okay, that all belonged to France. Now, there was some disputed territory up in the Oregon area between the U.S., Britain, France, and Russia. Okay, because no one was there other than probably a quarter of a million Native Americans, but they didn't count because they're not white and racism. I don't know if you're surprised or spoiler, but that's welcome to the United States for anyone who didn't know that. France got back all of their colonies in the Caribbean. Okay. By the way, Spain had control of most of the Caribbean, but France got back their colonies. And let's see, what else do I want to say? Uh, France also got back their colonies in Africa, and the U.S. promised to pay all the debts to Britain and to the Loyalists. There were new national symbols during this time. Okay, you have on the far left, and the symbol of the three men marching, the two drummers, and the man playing the flute. Uh, Very famous symbol. You'll see it appear on some of the propaganda that's used in later wars to try and inspire Americans to either invest or to register to fight. In the middle, you have "Don't Tread on Me." That is the original American flag, and you thought drawing 50 stars was complicated. Look at the intricate pattern on the snake there. If you're trying to draw that on your stuff to make it look like you're a patriot instead of just the flag. Let me see what else. Uh, and the Liberty Bell, which was a symbol of American freedom. A republic, by the way, is a government where power resides with the citizens. So the United States, since it has a representative body that are elected, that do the voting for the people, or not the voting, but they make laws for the people, whether it's in the House or now by the Senate. Originally, the Senate was not elected by the people, but by state legislatures or even appointments by the governor in some positions. Uh, a democracy is a rule by the majority. So if you're trying to explain the type of government that we have in the United States, it is a democratic republic. Okay, so the terms Democrats and Republicans really have nothing to do with democracy or republics. Okay, uh, popular sovereignty. Uh, this is where local citizens decide whether issues are illegal and or legal, and they also vote for their leaders. Uh, Next month, the first Tuesday of the month, we will have an election for, in addition to the president. Well, actually, I believe it's on the 10th that we're doing the election this year. So 4 weeks. So anyway, on the 10th, we'll have an election for the president, but then there will also be some smaller things going through where we will be, voting on local ordinances. A couple of years ago, we voted for to build a new stadium for the Cowboys. We voted to put in a new stadium for the Rangers. I live in Arlington, and that's some of the things that we voted on. Well, anyway, so that's part of popular sovereignty. Okay, so let's talk about how the revolution changes society. Okay, uh, when the revolution was over, property holding was no longer a requirement in order to be able to vote. The average person was in worse financial shape after the war than they were before. The currency was completely falling apart. Women had won some rights. Some of them served in the military, and after the war, they could become educated or even get a divorce. Now, they could be that there was no requirement for them to become educated. My grandmother, who was born in 1917 and is super dead right now, when she finished the eighth grade in 1930, right around the time of the Great Depression. Her father said, "You know what? You don't need to go to school anymore. You're just a girl. We need to go find you a rich husband." And so, maybe as an act of defiance, my grandmother married the poorest man in town, who was my grandfather. But he was a good dancer. He's also dead. Could not dance his way out of that. Abigail Adams, she pushed for equality, and she very famously writes a letter to her husband while the Constitution is being written, telling him not to forget the ladies, which they were mostly forgotten in the Constitution, and their rights would be kept from them for nearly 150 years, if you're counting. As for African Americans, many northern states abolished slavery, and thousands of slaves became free. So, Loyalists, along with some former slaves and Native American allies, found that it was a bad idea to stay in the Americas, and they went to other colonies in the Indies. So, about 80,000 people fled to the uh, the Indies for new opportunity. Okay. Former slaves were sent to Sierra Leone, which is where Britain put their freed slave population when they ended slavery there in 1807. So, FYI, some fun facts. So, the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom, that was separation of church and state. This is really the baby of Jefferson. Okay, and all states banned a tax for churches. So churches became tax exempt at this point. Okay, which doesn't sound like separation of church and state, but let's not let's not worry too much about that right now. Okay, let's look at some other key things like state governments. Now, there was no real strong central federal government. Uh, it was all state governments at this point. Okay, all the states made their own coins. They raised their own armies and navies. So you had 13 separate armies and navies in the United States. You had a written state constitution. Uh, People did not like the idea of a central leader, so the the governors or whoever would preside over the state had very weak positions. Let's see, what else do we want to say? Okay, they every year they would elect all of their electors. So the thought then was that then they would be more responsive to the people. What it actually meant is they campaigned all the time. The judicial branches and the executive branches were very weak. You have to remember think of how many of the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments, have to do with the court system, and a lot of that was because of the admiralty courts created by the British, where you were shipped off to Halifax in Nova Scotia, and you would sit in a jail sometimes for years and years before your case was ever heard. And there might not be enough evidence, or actually any evidence, to try you. They might get to you and go, you know what, we don't have anything that we're holding you for. So we'll release you in just a few, and then you might spend another 5 years there. So it became very important to develop a weak judicial and executive system when they first initiated the United States. So the Articles of Confederation were created in 1777, shortly after the Declaration of Independence. I don't know what language that is. Declaration of Independence. Okay, it was ratified in 1781, and the chief agency of this new government was a unicameral Congress. For those of you who know what a unicorn is, that's one horn, so there was one house of Congress. There was no executive branch. Each state was sovereign and had equal representation. So basically, you had a total of 13 separate nations. Okay? You want chaos, have that. Okay? And it was designed to be weak. Well, guess what? It was a success. If you wanted to make any changes at all to the Constitution, all 13 states had to agree. The government didn't have any type of power to regulate commerce or business. They paid debts by selling land, which would work as long as you had large tracts of land that people wanted. Ultimately, it's going to fail because it's way too weak. The Confederation Congress. So this is the only powerful body that's in America at the time. They met once a year. Okay, so they might meet for 2 or 3 months, but then they wouldn't meet again till the next year. Now they could call a special meeting, but remember how long it takes to get from Georgia to Philadelphia. At that time, you're looking at about a month. Okay, so they met once a year with the power to declare war, raise armies, and sign treaties. Right now, those are the same powers that are held by our Congress today. So, someone invades, you can't declare war until you get everyone back together. Bad idea. Don't know why they didn't see that. Raise armies, same thing. Someone invades, you have a bunch of militias, but none of them are really working together. Remember, a bunch of state armies instead of one national or federal army. Signing treaties less of an issue, but again, a very weak government was put together with this. The Land Ordinance of 1785, again, this goes back to selling land to pay off debts. And they also had a provision to build a public school in each settlement. Now, this is not the complicated system we have today, but this would be a single school building. And if you're lucky, it would have education all the way through sixth grade. Okay. Any education beyond that was unnecessary. They would think by that time you would have chosen a trade or decided to become a very, very poor farmer. Preferably a poor farmer because then you're less of an issue to other people. But if not, then you could go to trade school and learn how to become a candle maker. You could become a blacksmith, a silversmith. You could be a journalist. There were some actual professions, but not a lot of them. Now, I know what you're thinking. Who is this list of sexy beasts right here? Well, these are the original presidents of the Confederation Congress. And Uh, well, you can see how important it is because look right here. Between these two, Richard Mifflin and Henry Lee, you have a month with no leader. Here between Lee and Hancock, John Hancock, the only person you've probably heard of, you've got about 2 weeks, 2.5 weeks. Then you have a week between Hancock and Gorman. Here you've got 3 months with no one between Gorman and St. Clair. And then here's another 2.5 months between St. Clair and Griffin. So these weren't really extremely important positions. Okay, I think that's enough of having to suffer through the leaders of the Continental Congress. Let's go to something about as grueling as the last one. The Northwest Ordinance of 1787. Now, this one is pretty important. Okay, most importantly, it has to do with laws to govern territories, and it's still in use today. So, this is one of the few things from that that really stuck because how do you turn new land into a state or into a territory? You realize we've added 37 states since the since the U.S.'s inception. Okay, so uh, to become a state, or to become a territory, you need 5,000 men who can adult, who can elect a state legislature. Then you need 60,000 people to turn it into to make a state constitutional convention. Now, one of the things that happened when they passed the Northwest Territory is they banned all slavery up in that part of the country, and that is some of the best farmland in the world. Now, if you notice, this annoying land is also the Ohio River Valley, the same land that George Washington started the French and Indian War over about 33 years before this. Okay, so you have this is Indiana, Ohio, Illinois, Wisconsin, and Michigan. So anyway, just for fun, that is. Now, Shays' Rebellion. Now, this is really a turning point for the Confederation Congress, and we're really lucky as a country that this is how our problems were exposed by a man, Daniel Shays. So Daniel Shays was upset because Massachusetts raised taxes to pay its debts instead of printing money. Printing money to pay debts is very dangerous because what that does is it causes inflation. It's the whole thing of scarcity. You know, if you have something of value, it's valuable because there's only a finite amount of it. But if there's an endless supply, then it has no value at all. And so that's kind of the whole premise behind not paying your debts by printing more money. So Daniel Shays led a group of men to the state arsenal to get weapons to start a revolution. He was stopped by a state militia, but what this really does is it exposes the problems of a weak central government. Because if you remember, the only people that can raise an army is Congress. Okay? The only people who can declare war is Congress. And he waits to invade until Congress is done meeting because of how angry he is. And it shows just what kind of problems we would have if a major force were to come through. So again, we are lucky that it happened because of Shays' rebellion instead of an actual invasion. Now, causes of the Constitutional Convention. Number one is going to be the British merchants are flooding the U.S. markets with inexpensive goods. Okay, what does this mean for the consumer? The consumer is going to pay very little. Everything's going to be really cheap because the the whole reason that they do this is so that the U.S. doesn't start making their own stuff. You don't want another country to be your competition. You want your competitors to not have a need to make more stuff. Okay. Number two, the government could not force the states to pay their debts to Britain or to loyalists. Okay. Number three, okay, so basically that was one of the terms of the Treaty of Paris of 1783. That was the final one that all the colonists would pay their debts. The problem was for a lot of Americans, particularly in the South, they didn't want to pay their debts because the British freed about 15,000 slaves, and they said, you know what, they should call it even because they did that. Okay. There was a recession at the end of the war. Britain stopped buying our goods. They were selling us our stuff really cheap, but they wouldn't buy anything from us. So we had no market for our goods. Okay. You have Shays' rebellion and the fact that there's no control of commerce. And the reason that that's a problem, imagine you bought something from Oklahoma and it exploded whenever you got that. Okay, so the way that it would work is that you buy it, it explodes, and it burns your hands off. Okay, and so you decide to file suit as a result of it. Well, the problem is if they're in Oklahoma, you'd have to file suit in an Oklahoma court, and you're from Texas. Okay, so they might not represent, or they might not rule in your favor there. So you could do it here, and the problem is you can't force the people from Oklahoma to show up in the courts here. So it runs to a stalemate, and there's no one really to end that stalemate. So, the major goals of the Constitutional Convention. Number one, first and foremost, is to preserve the Union. Okay. No matter what they did, they wanted to keep the nation together. Okay. George Washington presided over this. Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, Thomas Paine, and John Hancock could not attend because they were tending to other issues. And the only people that were able to go to this were the wealthy. So this is going to be a major influence on how the United States is formed. Now, that leads us to the end of yet another day. Okay? So next time we're going to be diving deep into the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, and basically the different powers held by the government. So come prepared. We're going to have some fun. This is Mr. Dugdale signing out, and I will see you soon. Please don't turn to cannibalism.